There's a single word in Japan that can make a room fall silent, cancel a plan, or change someone's entire decision without anyone ever raising their voice. And today you'll learn exactly how it works, so it never quietly controls you again. Have you ever canceled something you actually wanted to do, just because you sensed, without anyone saying anything, that it might inconvenience someone else? Have you ever felt a wave of guilt wash over you from nothing more than a look, a pause, a slightly too long silence? You weren't imagining it. There's a real psychological mechanism behind that feeling, and in Japan it has a name, Meiwaku, the fear of being a bother to others. Most people spend their entire life being quietly steered by it without ever understanding what's actually happening in their own mind. Before I show you exactly how this works and how to stop it from controlling you, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and comment a time you did something you didn't want to do just to avoid disappointing someone. Let's go. Chapter 1. The Invisible Leash. The story I'm about to tell you happened to a man named Daniel. Daniel wasn't Japanese, had never even been to Japan, but he lived his entire adult life under a rule he couldn't name, following instructions nobody had ever spoken out loud. He canceled a trip he'd saved for 2 years because his mother sighed, just once, when he mentioned the dates conflicted with a family event. She never asked him to stay, she never said a single word of complaint. She just sighed, and looked briefly at the table, and Daniel found himself apologizing and rebooking his flights before he'd even consciously decided to. At work, he stayed 40 minutes past his shift most evenings, not because his manager asked him to, but because he'd watched a coworker leave on time once, and noticed, just barely, the manager's expression tighten for half a second. Nothing was said, nothing needed to be. Daniel absorbed the message instantly and adjusted his own behavior to make sure that expression never appeared aimed at him. He didn't think of himself as someone who lacked boundaries. He thought of himself as considerate, thoughtful, someone who simply noticed how his actions affected other people and adjusted accordingly. That's the story he told himself, and for years it felt true. But underneath that story, something else was actually running the show. A constant, low-grade scanning of every room he entered, searching for the smallest sign of disapproval, and surrendering to it instantly, every single time, before anyone had asked him to surrender anything at all. The moment that finally cracked this open for Daniel wasn't dramatic. He was sitting across from a friend who'd just returned from 2 years living in Tokyo, describing a concept she'd learned there almost as a footnote to a longer story. And as she explained it, Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest, the specific discomfort of finally having a name for a pattern he'd been living inside his entire life, without ever once seeing its shape clearly. Chapter 2. The Mechanism Behind the Silence. In Japan, Meiwaku describes the state of being a burden, an inconvenience, a disruption to the people around you, and avoiding it is treated less like good manners and more like a fundamental social law. Children are taught from a young age not to cause Meiwaku to others, not through lectures about kindness, but through a constant, ambient awareness of how their actions ripple outward into everyone else's comfort. It shapes something as small as how quietly a person speaks on a train, and something as large as how an entire family might avoid seeking help during a crisis. Because asking for help means becoming a burden, and becoming a burden is treated, at a felt level, as one of the worst things a person can do. Here's what makes Meiwaku such a powerful, almost invisible form of social pressure, and why it works without a single word ever being spoken. The signal that triggers it isn't verbal. It's a sigh, a slightly delayed response, a subtle change in posture, a facial expression held a half-second too long. None of these carry any explicit request. None of them are, technically, complaints. But the human nervous system reads them instantly and unconsciously, faster than conscious thought can intervene, and the guilt response fires before the rational mind even has a chance to evaluate whether the reaction is proportionate to what actually happened. A social psychologist who studies nonverbal communication and group dynamics found that humans detect subtle facial microexpressions of disapproval in well under a second, often faster than they can consciously identify what specific cue triggered the reaction. This isn't a uniquely Japanese neurological quirk. It's a universal human wiring, tuned by evolution to detect the earliest possible sign of social rejection, because for most of human history, being cast out of the group meant death. What Japanese culture did, deliberately and over centuries, was build an entire social structure around this ancient wiring, refining silence itself into one of the most efficient, guilt-triggering signals a person can send. The mechanism was never unique to one culture. It's simply been perfected there, made visible enough to finally study, name, and understand. Chapter 3. Recognizing the signal. Daniel's first step wasn't confronting anyone. It was learning to notice, in real time, the exact moment his body reacted to a silent cue, before his mind had built a story to justify the reaction. He started paying attention to a very specific physical sensation, a tightening low in his stomach, arriving almost instantly whenever someone paused a beat too long after he said something, or when a family member's expression flickered somewhere between neutral and disappointed. For the first time, instead of immediately reacting to that sensation by adjusting his behavior, apologizing, or rearranging his plans, he simply noticed it and named it. That's the guilt reflex firing. Nobody has actually asked me for anything yet. This single pause, inserted between the silent cue and his automatic response, was the entire technique, and it sounds almost too simple to matter. But it mirrors exactly what Daniel's friend had described about people in Japan who'd learned to recognize Meiwaku pressure being used on them rather than simply absorbing it unconsciously. The skill was never about becoming immune to the signal. It was about creating enough space to ask a single question before reacting. Is this actually my responsibility, or is this someone else's unspoken expectation that I've been trained to absorb as if it were my own? The first time Daniel tried this, his mother sighed again, this time about a different plan entirely. He felt the familiar tightening in his stomach, the old pull to immediately apologize and change course. Instead, he paused, silently, for perhaps 2 full seconds, and simply asked her directly, "Is something wrong?" She said no. Everything was fine, a little too quickly. Nothing dramatic happened, but Daniel didn't cancel anything that day, and the sky didn't fall, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, an unspoken cue had arrived, and he had chosen, deliberately, not to obey it automatically. Chapter 4. The real obstacle. But recognizing the signal from family was one thing. The harder test came at work, where the stakes felt higher and the silent pressure came wrapped in something closer to professional expectation rather than simple disappointment. His manager never once said Daniel needed to stay late, but every time Daniel left at his scheduled time, he noticed the same flicker he'd once seen aimed at his coworker, the same half-second tightening, and his stomach responded exactly as it always had, screaming that leaving on time was somehow an act of disloyalty. This is where Daniel discovered the second, harder layer of the practice, the part that goes beyond simply noticing the reflex. Recognizing the guilt signal doesn't automatically dissolve it. Sometimes you feel it fully, completely, and choose to act differently anyway, tolerating the discomfort of the unresolved feeling, rather than letting it dictate the decision. This is genuinely uncomfortable in a way that noticing alone isn't, because the guilt doesn't simply vanish the moment you name it. It sits there, insistent, asking to be resolved the old way. A researcher studying workplace boundary setting and burnout found a pattern that reframed how Daniel understood his own hesitation. People who struggle most with boundaries rarely lack the awareness that a boundary is needed. What they lack is tolerance for the specific discomfort of leaving a silent expectation unmet, of letting someone else's disappointment exist without immediately rushing to fix it. Boundary setting, the research suggested, isn't primarily a communication skill. It's a distress tolerance skill, the capacity to let an uncomfortable feeling remain unresolved without collapsing back into the old automatic response just to make it go away faster. Daniel left on time that Friday, felt the full weight of his manager's flicker of disapproval, and did not stay to fix it. He drove home with the tight feeling still sitting in his chest the entire way, unresolved, uncomfortable, and completely survivable. Chapter 5. Building the Distinction. Here's where the practice compounds into something durable rather than a single act of defiance that fades by the next difficult moment. Daniel began keeping a mental, and eventually written, distinction between two categories of guilt that had always felt identical to him before. The first category, guilt that arrived because he genuinely caused harm, broken a real commitment, or let someone down in a way that mattered. The second category, guilt that arrived purely from a silent cue, a sigh, a pause, a flicker, with no actual harm attached to it at all, only someone else's unspoken preference going unmet. For years, both categories had felt like the exact same sensation in his body, and he had treated them identically, rushing to resolve both with the same urgency. The practice wasn't learning to feel less guilt. It was learning to sort the two categories correctly, in real time, before deciding how much weight the feeling actually deserved. Genuine harm still moved him to repair things quickly. Unspoken preference, arriving as a sigh with no real stakes attached, increasingly moved him far less than it used to, because he could finally see it clearly for what it was. This distinction, once built, compounded across every relationship in his life almost simultaneously. His mother's sighs still registered, but carried less automatic authority over his decisions. His manager's flickers of disapproval still landed, but no longer dictated when he left the office. None of this happened through a single confrontation or a dramatic speech about boundaries. It happened through dozens of small moments, each one slightly easier than the last, because the gap between silent cue and automatic obedience had been trained, deliberately, one uncomfortable pause at a time. Chapter 6. Pre-solving the hardest moments. Even with months of practice, Daniel found certain situations still overwhelmed the gap entirely, collapsing him instantly back into old obedience before he'd had any chance to pause. Large family gatherings, where multiple silent cues arrived simultaneously from several directions at once, proved especially difficult. The accumulated pressure simply too much to process and sort in real time. So he pre-solved it, the same way people navigating Meiwaku heavy environments learn to prepare specific, pre-decided responses before entering situations they know will be difficult. Before family events, Daniel decided in advance, while calm and clear-headed, exactly which commitments were genuinely non-negotiable to him and which he was willing to flex on if pressure arrived. He wrote it down beforehand. I am staying until 8, not later, regardless of any size. I am not offering to host again this year, regardless of how the conversation is steered. There was no decision left to make in the overwhelming moment itself, because the decision had already been made, in writing, during a moment when his judgment wasn't being flooded by a room full of silent cues firing at once. This single preparation removed exactly the moment where his old pattern used to reassert itself completely, not because the silent pressure stopped existing, but because he no longer had to process and resist it fresh, in real time, with no plan already in place. Chapter 7. The Transformation. A year into this practice, Daniel hadn't become someone who ignored other people's feelings, and that distinction matters enormously. He still noticed sighs, still felt the flicker of a disappointed expression, still cared genuinely about the people around him. What had changed was the automatic authority those silent cues held over his decisions. He could feel a sigh land, register it fully, and still choose to take the trip, still choose to leave on time, still choose to say no, because he'd finally separated the sensation of someone else's disappointment from an obligation to immediately fix it. People who knew him before struggled to name exactly what was different, because the change showed up in absences rather than announcements, the trip he finally took, the evenings he actually left on time, the plans he no longer silently canceled. Nobody saw the internal mechanism, the thousands of small pauses inserted between a silent cue and an old automatic response, one uncomfortable moment at a time, until the pattern had genuinely changed. That's the real power of understanding Meiwaku, once you see it clearly. It was never really about Japan, or waterfalls of culture unique to one place. It's about a universal human wiring, refined into its sharpest form, that governs how easily other people's unspoken preferences can silently steer your entire life. Once you can see the mechanism, name the sensation, and pause before obeying it automatically, the silence loses its authority over you. It becomes, simply, someone else's feeling, no longer your instruction. If this helped you recognize a pattern in your own life, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. And tell me in the comments, when was the last time you did something you didn't want to do, just because of a look nobody explained?